So greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jamal Sealy, coming to you from the corporate trauma team. And today we're going to be discussing corporate trauma along with my two colleagues.
Hi, I'm Holland Nance.
And I'm Rob Felder.
So we know that there is a lot that goes into the lives of professionals, but we rarely talk about what we bring to work and what happens to us while we're there and how we cope, how we deal, how we get over to being the top professionals back to the next day. What we wanted to introduce is a concept, an umbrella concept that kind of envelops everything that we go through on a daily basis. But we want to talk about it more on the negative side to try to produce some solutions on the other end of the things that we have to cope with that we may not necessarily want to all the time. We have come up with a phrase, with a terminology, with something new, a new name for an old condition, and it's called corporate trauma. What is corporate trauma? Corporate trauma is the psychological, physiological, spiritual, emotional, financial, and or disruption from significant or sustained negative interactions and experiences over time, which are associated with performance, environment, hierarchy, stakeholders, or competitors of any group or individual within the corporate industrial complex. So corporate trauma could be a number of things. We know it could be discrimination. We know it could be workplace harassment, marginalization. But regardless of what we identify it as, we know that these different things that sometimes we have to cope with during our workday and our professional lives come with residual effects that we have to build a plan and a blueprint around so that we can be the best professionals that we can possibly be. So tonight we want to discuss what that looks like organically on the ground. So first I want to talk to Holland. Holland, what, in your perspective, from your professional experience, what can you relate to the concept, a new name for an old condition, corporate trauma?
Well, thank you, Jamal. When I first heard of this concept and this idea, I instantly began to relate to just some of the residual effects of a workplace environment that sometimes just does not answer or resolve your need for fulfillment. And in various ways that may show up. It may be a very tense environment. It may be an environment that does not speak to your overall career goals or help you identify what those career goals really are and prepare you a plan or help develop that in a mutually conducive way. It also may be sometimes after or at the end of a very stressful workday, you feel pretty much depleted. And all of those things, I think, are comprised within that concept of corporate trauma, right? The residual effects, how it impacts our ability to relate to other aspects of our lives, our families, our social life, our own personal dreams and desires, all of those things, I think, are impacted by a traumatic work environment.
Thank you, Holly. And Robert, I want to come to you, and obviously, I want you to give me what your perspective is on corporate trauma. But along with that, do you think you could share any examples of yourself or anyone that you know that may be able that our audience can relate to with respect to corporate trauma?
Sure. So for me, when I'm thinking of corporate trauma, the piece that comes to mind is when you have to operate with a dual mindset, right? You're an employee, but maybe you don't fit the description or the profile of what that typical employee may look like or how that person may act. So the best example that I can give is one of myself, but also individuals who may look like me. I come into the office 250 pounds, 6'4", and a black man. And now I got facial hair that I come along with. And sometimes when you're working in the workplace, you find yourself, or especially when you're younger, and you're really trying to put together your whole entire package, you start to realize that what you bring to the table, sometimes people don't accept that. And they may not say directly like, hey, Robert, cut your hair off, or you know what, maybe we don't want you to wear suits every day, or we don't want you use your hands too much when you speak, right? Or you know what, you move kind of aggressive when you're in your presentations. And you find yourself trying, not so much emulating success, but more or less getting rid of or lessening who you are and what makes you who you are. So when I think of corporate trauma, the piece that really, really touches me is that everyone doesn't have to do that. And when everyone doesn't have to do that, it's really disheartening when you really start to process that only you and certain people who come into the workplace, that it wasn't meant for them, or it wasn't built for them, or certain things aren't socially accepted within the workplace. And it's very troubling. But on top of that, it's something that if you don't have the right support system, if you don't have people around you who can speak to it and show you different ways to get around it and not allow it to kind of minimize who you are, you'll find yourself in a difficult situation that you don't know how to get out of. So for me, corporate trauma is definitely near and dear, and the effects of having to cover up who you are very troubling.
Right, I agree with you. Corporate trauma is something that is personal. It is a really hard and moving target to kind of catch. And, Colin and Robert, you talked about what corporate trauma is. And we know that basically it's just a line or a string of negative experiences, or maybe one or two significant ones that you have experienced, that now you have a pattern, or you have a particular familiar defense mechanism or coping mechanism that you retreat back to when familiar environments or incidents that may take place in the workplace, that may put you back in that mind frame that reminds you of those things that we are trying to get around, that encompasses what corporate trauma is. But what I want to talk about now is what corporate trauma feels like. We know that we assert as the corporate trauma team that some of the symptoms, that can be associated with these negative experiences and interactions is fear and stress and anxiety, anger, even frustration, leading up to depression and cognitive dissonance. Holland, would you be able to give us an idea of what corporate trauma feels like after the negative experiences, after the interactions, and when you are reminded of these things on a daily basis if they're not resolved?
I think one of the key things that represent all the emotional responses or effects of corporate trauma is the constant questioning, right? When you've had a negative experience and you really have given your very best effort, and that effort is rejected or it's not rated as highly as you would have expected, then there is the series of questioning, second guessing your intellect, your skills, your abilities to perform at a high level. I think anytime you're in a position where you're constantly questioning yourself, it starts to show real evidence, right, in your future performance. So when there's questioning, then you become more insecure, right? You're not as creative, and you're not as willing to speak up and be a viable part of any real team interaction or to put forth new ideas, because it starts to eat away at your security and your confidence. So those effects, right? Fear and anger and anxiety and stress, those things start to really build. And over time, you'll see some effects that start to show up in other areas of your life. It shows up in your ability to really be a future-minded thinker as it relates with new innovations. That whole creative thought, when you're questioning, you are not able to really fully move in that creative space if you have that high level of confidence. So corporate trauma, I really think, can begin to deplete our ability to move forward on our career paths if it's not properly addressed.
Excellent. Yeah, right. I mean, Robert, so Holland made some great points. The depletion of creative energy, not taking your whole self into the workplace and being able to get around those negative interactions. But what does corporate trauma feel like to you, Robert? Where do you get it? Where do you touch it at?
And I agree with what Holland mentioned as well. The piece that really jumps out to me is the hollow effect. And what I mean by the hollow effect is when you end up getting so caught up with what's happening externally, right? You align yourself very, very well with what the corporation is talking about, what the company is talking about, what the organization, what the team, a fraternity, a sorority, whatever the case may be. You align yourself with them so well that who you are on the inside is gone. So when those structures start to break down, or you find out that they aren't who you thought they were, or those structures don't represent what you thought they represented, then next thing you know, you find yourself questioning if you are the person you thought you were. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times with the individuals that I coach, whether adults or young adults, it really comes down to that piece around understanding who you are before you get there, and really understand that you're a part of the team, and that team is, hey, I'm working with this company and we're striving towards a goal. I give my time and they pay for that time, not this, what I am a part of here makes me. And that's the big part that I feel as if many people run into, that issue of, the job makes me, what I experience makes me. So I'll sacrifice certain things. I'll give up who I am. I'll give up my accent if I'm from the South. And I know some individuals, regardless of what they look like, if they're from if they're from a certain region in America, they'll lose that accent. If they're from Tennessee, if they're from Alabama, whatever the case may be, but trying to fit in and trying to more or less hide and cover what you bring to the table and what's natural to you. It's difficult. So you find yourself hiding those things, but over time, when you're hiding what's natural, you also end up hiding and losing out on the opportunity to continue to grow. So that hollowing effect jumps out to me the most, especially when I'm thinking about continuous growth. You can't grow when you have nothing to build on.
Thank you, Robert. Phenomenal. The hollow effect is definitely something that I know that I could relate to. But moving into what corporate trauma is, now we know what it is, what it feels like. Part of the concept of corporate trauma is the specific identification of where it is. And we've identified it existing within the corporate industrial complex. Holland, when I say corporate industrial complex, how does that resonate with you with respect to corporate trauma?
I personally, whenever I hear that phrase, it creates a visual image, right? There are other words or other facilities where we use that industrial complex phrasing, And it is absolutely not the most positive place to be. So it gives me visual images of confinement and limitation. And it creates a feeling of powerlessness. So I think it's important to understand sometimes it feels just that way when we're working in corporate environments, that we truly are in a corporate industrial complex where we're pretty much at the whim of someone else's control, right? Someone chooses how your career path advances. Someone chooses how much money you're able to earn. Someone chooses what sort of professional development opportunities are made available to you. And yes, we do have a lot of personal responsibility in that space, but overall, there are things that we simply don't have the full authority to make final decisions about. So it's important to be mindful that when we are working in the corporate environment, that we really take a full opportunity to be aware, right? Are we really feeling completely powerless? Or do we take full advantage of the opportunities that are available to us and begin to take a more proactive approach and not wait to be selected, but start being your own kind of pusher for opportunities, be your own spokesperson for your skill sets and abilities, and being willing to accept things sometimes that fall outside of the typical job description, right? Because people need folks who are willing and ready to serve. And then that feeling of the corporate industrial complex starts to diminish bit by bit.
Fantastic. So, Robert, Holland just spoke about the corporate industrial complex, and we know that the corporate industrial complex is a linkage between three, big industries, not totally exclusive to, but, mostly represented by the educational system that prepares individuals to go into the corporate sector itself, that is existing of not for-profit organizations, and then you have the non-profit organizations that are set up like corporations that are used to kind of facilitate the discretionary revenue and income of some of these for-profit organizations, and they're all kind of existing within this trilateral circle. With respect to that approach to understanding what the corporate industrial complex is, Robert, what's your opinion on when a professional could expect to experience corporate trauma?
So, one, you can experience it day one out of college. The difference is when you get there, you've already been trained that that's just life, that's just grown-up land. And the expectations of other individuals, what you're supposed to sacrifice, that can be day one. But what also comes along, when it also really starts to creep up on you, the higher you get up. The higher you get up, the more you have to sacrifice. The higher you get up, the more Kool-Aid you have to drink. The more Kool-Aid you have to drink, the less you can talk about the cavities, right? And let's be upfront about what I mean by the cavities. That means the less you can talk about what you don't like. So when you have to lose your voice, it's troubling. And a lot of times on the front end of your career, you're okay with not having a voice. You've been trained from maybe doing certain things with your parents, culturally, through college, through what you've experienced with your teachers in college. And then by the time you get to work, you've been finding different parts of yourself, but now the individuals at work are saying, hey, I want you to be just like this. I want you to fit right here. Okay? It's cool that you're 6'4", but the ideal height would be about 6'1". Can you scoot down a little bit? And for that first check, you find yourself, you start to compromise. And that's the interesting thing, especially when we talk about accountability. There's some personal accountability that comes along with it, but we also have to think about how we've been trained. You know, how we've been trained, and this isn't a race thing; it's a people thing. You know, you got to sacrifice, and that's what people will tell you. You have to sacrifice. The one thing I will say is when you're thinking about all these different pieces and when it happens and how it happens, is how important are you to you? You know, because the company has no problem pushing itself on you. And that's the one thing I always want. Every time I get the opportunity to talk to folks, I'm like, the organization has no problem making sure that it puts its pressure of who it is on you, the expectations on you. It's sort of like being in a relationship and only one person is talking about what they like. Only one person is talking about what they love. Only one person is talking about what's next, what's the expectations, where we're going. And all you're doing is like, oh, yeah, sure. Hey, cool. You know, just give me a performance review, 3% on the COLA. And then if I can get a bump up in a promotion, you know, awesome. Hey, you know, and then 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line, when you realize your whole entire life has been wrapped up in this, and you realize you can't get out. And that's why when you meet people who are miserable at work, they realize what they've done. They realize what they accepted. They realize what they've sacrificed, and that was themselves. So it's across the board, in the beginning of your career, in the middle of your career, and then you even find some people who are CEOs, and they're like, you know, I'm just done. I'm burned out. I can't do it anymore. And you're like, well, you got billions of dollars, millions of dollars. What do you mean you're about to go and be a Zen master? But, you know, I've done a lot of different things, and I realized that what I'm sacrificing isn't worth sacrificing for somebody else to tell me that they don't even appreciate what I'm giving up. You know, so throughout life, you are always going to run into a complex, whether it be the corporate industrial complex or something amongst the family structures. It's there. Our job is to continue to push back on it.
Thank you, Robert. Excellent. So, Holland, I heard you kind of mention some residual effects, and I want to go back to that because I think that is very valuable commentary. So some of the residual effects that we, the corporate trauma team, have identified is low confidence, low self-esteem, the likelihood of you as a professional finding ways to self-medicate, isolating yourself, and then something that we coined the last one in, first one out phase. After your career starts rolling, you go from job to job or from position to position, and you find yourself being, you know, I'm the last one to kind of get this opportunity, and I'm the first one to kind of get, you know, ousted. And when we take a look back at our career and assess the patterns, and then we realize that, hey, I might be feeling the effects of something. We're calling that something corporate trauma. But I want to, with you, with the thoughts of those residual effects from the initial emotions of this concept, with the fear and the stress and the anxiety and the anger, I want to talk about what your opinion is on some of the solutions. As professionals, we know we can proactively plan and continue to hold on to the idea of why we're in a place. We can be honest with ourselves. We can set boundaries. We can be disciplined and have that work-life balance so that the sacrifices that Robert talked about aren't so detrimental, or it's fulfillment balancing the sacrifices. And then, you know, there's a methodology around critical thinking on how to navigate through some of these tough experiences and tough interactions. What is your take on how someone can invoke some of these solutions, or some that we may not have talked about, to kind of get through these residual effects, to kind of unwrap the confines of what corporate trauma is?
Well, thank you, Jamal. I think there are a couple of ways that we can move into a more powerful position, right? When we have experienced corporate trauma and start to see residual effects throughout various parts of our lives, Robert did a great job alluding to one of the most important factors, and that is a strong sense of self-identity. It's really, really critical, especially the older you get or the more years you spend in a certain career path or in a certain role, for you to have a strong sense of who you really are at the core, right? Your own list of core values, things that help guide your decision-making skills, so that if you're ever in a moment of conflict, then you have a core place to go, which serves as your foundation to answer hard questions, right? Does this really support my core values, or am I beginning to make really important or severe compromises? So having a strong sense of self-identity, acknowledging your core values, having a clear picture of who you really, really are, knowing that no particular role or no particular person, whether they approve or don't approve, none of that really does define who you are. And secondly, have a place where you go back to refuel. I have a personal handbook that I relate to my coaching clients, right? To have a handbook, your own personal handbook. It could include other references, motivational information. It could include scriptures. It could be the place where you go to remind yourself of who you are, because we're constantly pouring out. We're constantly impacted or encountering opposition. And each time we power through any of those situations, we begin to dispense a part of who we are. So sometimes when you're constantly dispensing and you're constantly pouring out, you're constantly shedding or sharing your, positive motivations, or keeping or trying to keep yourself at that high level, at some point you have to go and refuel. So go back to remind yourself of who you really are. Remind yourself of what really, really matters to you, so that you can progressively continue to move in that whole phase of honesty and balance and critical thinking. Because if we don't have a clear insight, even when we start to observe situations, sometimes that viewpoint can be slanted and we don't have an accurate depiction of what we're seeing, that we think we're seeing clearly. But because we haven't properly refueled ourselves, our ability to accurately think critically about what we're observing is impaired. And whenever we're making decisions, from an impaired viewpoint, sometimes it doesn't get us to where we really want to be. So I just believe in having a strong core sense of who you are, and having a systemic way to refuel yourself will get you to where you should be.
Thank you, Holly. Robert, we're talking about solutions. We're talking about how to protect ourselves. We're talking about, what the Captain America has a shield. What is the shield for the modern day professional for corporate trauma? One of the things that you talked about earlier is, not forgetting, what drives you and what is motivating us to be that person that we were envisioning ourselves being. And we know that the corporate industrial complex is born right out of the entrepreneurial spirit. But one of the things that we see is that the modern day corporate professional forgets how to tap into that entrepreneurial spirit. And one of the things that we've coined the phrase on is using what you love to produce what you need. That you can make an existence for yourself. You can sustain yourself through what you love, and you can economize that in multiple situations. But as a solution-based thought process, as thinking of what is what is Captain America's shield here with respect to the modern day professional looking at corporate trauma? What can we use to ultimately protect us from this negative, this deeply rooted and often giving back, terrible concept, corporate trauma? What is the shield here? How can I use what I love to produce what I need? I need to eat.
So the piece that comes to mind for me is you are your own business, right? And I definitely was going to say entrepreneur. But the thought is you're your own corporation. And the one thing when it comes down to corporations, they look out for their interests. And as individuals, I don't know where the mindset comes from that if you have more money, if you have more resources, then you know more, right? And you know what's best for me. And as an individual who questions a lot of things, and that's the one thing that I always say to folks, one, you want to be able to be your own business. You want to be an entrepreneur, have that mindset, right? But then on top of that, in being an entrepreneur, that also means that you question things. You tinker. Your critical thinking skills are continuously growing because you're in the process of breaking things down and putting them back together. When you actually get hit head on, full force with corporate trauma, those pieces fall to the waistline. And you end up being, I don't know if you guys remember the Jetsons, but you end up being one of those spacely sprockets, one of those cogs in the machine where, they just put it in and take it back out. And that piece, yes, it's important. It's just as important as long as it's working. And when it's no longer working, it can take you out. But when you're indispensable, when you're that linchpin, that means that you do something that they can't replace. You do something that is unique to you. I tell people all the time, if you're working with me, I may not be the best in everything, but it is guaranteed there's going to be one thing that I do the best. And that one thing is the thing you don't want to let go, right? You probably don't want to let go. And it's like, man, Rob gets on my nerves. He kind of aggravates me, drive me crazy, but man, he can make a mean omelet. it could be whatever. It could be basic. And sometimes I think we believe that we have to fly or we have to walk on water in order to be appreciated. And a large part of it being appreciated is understanding your worth, but also understanding how what you bring to the table is worth something to the organization, and you're not afraid to share that and let people know. And by understanding your value, you won't have a problem questioning. Because I tell people the basis and the foundation for me questioning things is really around, I don't want to waste my time. Because that's what the company says. Listen, if they feel as if you don't meet the qualifications or the standards any longer, they're going to cut you loose. You don't meet the tests, and they're not going to waste their time. And as employees and as team members, we have a tough time realizing that it takes us a long time. And my whole entire thing, just to get back to answering your question, being an entrepreneur, being your own business, your own corporation, and then those critical thinking skills and questioning. You want to make sure you're questioning. When folks say, be something, you make sure that you're the person that when you show up and you wake up in the morning, you're like, hey, I'm going to give my best and I'm going to push that everybody else does the same.
Wow. Excellent. Excellent, Robert. Excellent, Colin. This is what corporate trauma is. These are the branches. This is the trunk, and this is some of the roots to what this concept is. But to restate, because we kind of talked about a lot, corporate trauma, remember, corporate trauma is the physiological, psychological, spiritual, emotional, financial damage and or disruption resulting from significant or sustained negative interactions and experience over time, which are associated with performance, environment, hierarchy, stakeholders, and or competitors of any group or individual within, yes, the corporate industrial complex. So kind of tying it back in, Holland, Robert, Holland, I'll start with you. Any final thoughts, anything that you wanted to, restate or add that we may not have captured from the earlier commentary from you?
Well, thank you, Jamal. Corporate trauma, like you said, is a new name for an old condition. So it's nothing new. It's something that not only we have experienced, but those who have gone before us and those who are in the process, new first-time employees in the corporate environment. We exist, though, to help people maximize every opportunity, and also to make sure that no one is overcome by the effects of corporate trauma. So we want to provide support and skills and tools and resources to help people fully maximize every opportunity and not be so overcome with the effects of corporate trauma that they really miss out on all of the wonderful opportunities that are still available to each one of us. So if there's any lasting thought I can leave with our audience is no, this isn't a griping session. This is an honest review and real chance for us to really acknowledge some truths about what has been happening and what may very well continue to happen for the rest of human existence. But the lasting thought is you can still win even in an environment that's filled with corporate trauma. And we just want to help you win.
Beautiful. Robert, what say you, my friend?
That especially, I just heard Holland touch on it, which makes perfect sense. There are going to be people who tell you to suck it up and stop complaining. Something that I understand about America is, in the world in general, but definitely America. In the moment, people cannot understand what's going on, especially when what you're complaining about is the normal. When what you're talking about is what their fathers and mothers did and their grandmothers and grandfathers did for generations. It's difficult to have that paradigm shift, that changing of the worldview. But one thing that I know that I've realized in America, we are usually 20 years behind. So when those groups of individuals finally step up and they're like, we're not taking this anymore. And people throw tomatoes at them, they sick dogs on them, blow them down with fire hoses. And then over the course of time, people realize that not just how they approach those individuals and what they went through, and when they was actually telling you that something was wrong, but the whole entire period before they opened their mouths and shared that those things were wrong was a bad thing. So the one thing I would say is don't be silenced, right? Folks usually talk about, especially with mental health, and we're not here to diagnose anyone. But what folks usually always say is, don't suffer in silence. And when it comes down to work, there's a lot of people who suffer in silence. They sit there and they take it because the person who sits across from them, oh, you know what, man, I can't stand people who complain. Now, the difference is the person who is telling you that they don't like people who complain, they don't deal with the same things you do, or they don't deal with it the same way, or whatever that thing that aggravates them isn't the part that's being bothered. So don't assume that someone else who doesn't walk in your shoes every day can tell you that you're crying, or you're a crybaby, or you should just suck it up, the best thing you can do is speak and make sure that you're heard and make sure that you're felt, and not sit back and expect that other people will understand. And the last thing I will say is, don't expect that people know. Don't expect that people know they're doing you wrong. And that's where the problem is. Well, he knows that he's doing something wrong. Something's going to happen. Don't assume. Because even though it's wrong, that doesn't mean people want to stop. And that doesn't mean that people are paying attention to how you feel. And that's the one thing I hope we all take away from this conversation, that we're opening up and we're sparking and we're looking to spearhead and lead the way, is common sense is only common when you have something in common. And when you're in the workplace, it's built for you to have the understanding of the workplace and of that company. It's not built for you to be the individual. That whole entire time when you're there, it's pushing on you to lose who you are. And in some cases, some of you may disappear a little bit, but it's a different thing when it dies. Because when it dies, sometimes it's not able to be replaced. So with that being said, make sure you have an idea. One, know who you are, but also know, how when they say when you're getting into a relationship, know who you're getting into bed with. Well, know who you're spending 8+ hours a day with. Understand those cultural pieces, understand those individuals and what their expectations are. And from there, you'll start to do some great things and you won't suffer anymore.
Great, fantastic, fabulous, truly inspirational conversation. The last thing that I would say and leave us with, that just remember, corporate trauma is sneaky. It's a passive trauma. You don't know it's there until you look for it. And we, Colin, Robert, myself, Jamal, we're the corporate trauma team, and we're here to give you the description of what to look for, what it feels like, when it happens, where it is, what are the symptoms, what are the residual effects, and then also what are the solutions. And never forget, use what you love to produce what you need. That's your ultimate shield to prevent these things from ever happening. And then to sniff out corporate trauma where it rears its ugly, sneaky head. So with that, it's been an honor and pleasure to present something that is near and dear to all of our hearts. We hope that you have taken something away that resonates with you. And remember, you heard it here first, corporate trauma, a new name for an old condition. Thank you.